A cast iron skillet never came with instructions that mattered. Someone had to stand beside you and show you the color the fat needed to be, the sound a biscuit made when it was finally ready. None of it fit on a recipe card. And the pan remembered every meal it had ever cooked, seasoned deeper with each one. So when it passed from one pair of hands to the next, it never arrived empty. These are 25 forgotten cast iron skillet meals from the 1950s. No one makes anymore. Subscribe before we begin. The countdown starts now. Fried green tomatoes. The Southern supper that turned the unripe tomatoes still on the vine at the end of summer into something crisp and tart and unforgettable. Sliced thick, dredged in cornmeal, and fried in the skillet until the coating went golden and crackling. Green tomatoes cost nothing from the garden in 1955. Cornmeal, egg, and lard. Total then under 25 cents. Today under $3. Fed 4. You sliced the tomatoes thick. You dredged them in cornmeal, seasoned with salt and pepper. You fried them in hot fat in the skillet until the coating went deep gold and the tomato inside stayed firm and tart. Knowing when a green tomato was firm enough to fry and not so unripe it stayed bitter was a judgment made with the hands, testing give against a thumb, a skill nobody wrote down because everybody who needed it had already been shown. Fried green tomatoes came from Southern garden cooking, using what the frost was about to ruin. By 1955, they were a late summer standard across the South. The last tomatoes of the season, saved by a hot skillet and a hand that already knew what it was feeling for. Skillet cornbread. The bread that could not be made properly in anything but a hot, well-seasoned cast iron pan. Cornmeal batter poured into a skillet already smoking with bacon grease, so the edges crisped the instant it hit the metal. Cornmeal cost 3 cents a cup in 1954, today around 20 cents. Buttermilk, egg, and bacon grease. Total then under 20 cents, today under $2. Fed 8. You heated bacon grease in the skillet until it smoked. You poured in the batter and it sizzled loud on contact. You baked it at 425 until the top went golden and the edges pulled away from the pan. That sizzle was the entire test. Too quiet and the crust would never form. A recipe could tell you the oven temperature. It could not tell you what that sound was supposed to sound like. Skillet cornbread came from Southern farm kitchens, where the hot pan was the entire secret. By 1954, it was daily bread across the rural South and Appalachia. The sizzle when the batter hit the grease told you everything. And it told a different woman the same thing every single time she made it. Hash brown potatoes. The breakfast that required nothing but potatoes, fat, and the patience not to touch the pan. Shredded potatoes pressed flat into hot bacon grease and left alone until a deep golden crust formed on the bottom. Potatoes cost 20 cents for 5 pounds in 1955. Today, around $3. Bacon grease and onion. Total then under 30 cents. Today, under $4. Fed 4. Chicken fried steak. The dish that took the toughest, cheapest cut of round steak, pounded it thin, and turned it into something that ate like the best steak in the house, dredged in flour, fried hard in the skillet, and smothered in a peppery white cream gravy. Round steak cost 59 cents a pound in 1956. Today, around $6. Flour, milk, and lard. Total then under $1. Today, under $8. Fed 4. You pounded the steak thin with a mallet. You dredged it twice in seasoned flour. You fried it hard in the skillet until deep golden, then made a cream gravy right in the same pan from the drippings. Knowing how much flour the drippings could absorb before the gravy turned pasty instead of silky was not measured. It was felt, whisk in hand, by someone who had made this gravy wrong enough times as a girl to finally make it right. Chicken fried steak came from Texas and the Greater South, where every diner and every home kitchen claimed to make it best. By 1956, it was a weeknight standard across the region. The cheapest steak in the case, treated like the finest one on the menu, because someone had once stood close enough to learn how. Pineapple upside-down cake. The dessert that turned a can of pineapple and a handful of maraschino cherries into the most requested dessert of the entire decade. Brown sugar and butter melted in the skillet first, pineapple rings arranged on top, and cake batter poured over before the whole thing was flipped out onto a plate. A can of pineapple cost 29 cents in 1956. Today, around $1.79. Butter, brown sugar, and cake batter. Total then under 60 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 10. You melted butter and brown sugar directly in the skillet until it went dark and syrupy. You arranged pineapple rings and cherries in the sugar. You poured cake batter over everything and baked until done, then flipped the whole skillet onto a plate. The flip itself was the moment every daughter had to watch her mother do a dozen times before attempting it herself, because a badly timed flip meant the whole cake stayed stuck to the iron, and only experience taught the difference. Pineapple upside-down cake became a mid-century classic the moment canned pineapple became affordable and widely available. By 1956, it was the dessert every hostess in America knew how to make. Flipping the hot skillet over the plate was the moment of truth, passed down one nervous attempt at a time. Skillet meatloaf. The loaf that a grandmother in nearly every American town swore could only be made properly in a well-seasoned cast-iron skillet, never a loaf pan. Ground beef pressed flat into the pan and started on the stovetop before finishing in the oven. Ground beef cost 39 cents a pound in 1955. Today, around $5.50. Breadcrumbs, egg, onion, ketchup. Total then under $1. Today, under $8. Fed 6. You mixed the beef with breadcrumbs, egg, and onion. You pressed it into the hot skillet and seared the bottom on the stovetop before glazing the top and finishing it in the oven. Nobody could explain in words why a loaf pan produced a lesser result. They could only show you the difference, side by side, until you tasted it yourself and understood without needing the explanation at all. Skillet meatloaf was passed down specifically as a cast-iron recipe because the seared crust it produced could not be replicated any other way. By 1955, it was a weekly fixture nationwide. That bottom crust was the reason grandmothers refused to switch pans, and the reason was never fully translatable into words. Skillet Salisbury steak. The oval beef patties browned hard in the skillet and smothered in a dark mushroom and onion gravy built right in the same pan from the drippings left behind. Ground beef cost 39 cents a pound in 1955. Today, around $5.50. Onion, mushrooms, and broth. Total then under $1. Today, under $8. Fed 4. You shaped seasoned beef into ovals and browned them hard in the skillet. You removed them and built a gravy from the drippings with onion, mushrooms, and broth. You returned the patties to simmer in the gravy. The gravy depended entirely on what was already stuck to the bottom of that particular pan, built up over years of the same family cooking the same meals in it. A different skillet made a different gravy, quietly, without anyone quite being able to say why. Salisbury steak in a skillet came from Dr. James Salisbury's health regimen of the 1880s, adapted into a working kitchen standard. Here is something worth sitting with before we go any further. Every single instruction in this video so far has depended on a sense that cannot be photographed, measured, or printed. The color of fat that is ready. The sound of batter hitting hot grease. The moment a crust has actually formed and can finally be touched. None of that lives on a page. It lives in a body that has done it enough times to recognize it without thinking. That is why these recipes traveled the way they did. Not through cookbooks, though cookbooks existed, but through a girl standing at her mother's elbow on 100 ordinary afternoons, absorbing information that neither of them would have called information at the time. It was just Tuesday. It was just supper. Nobody thought they were preserving anything. They were. Skillet apple pie. The dessert that used the skillet as both the cooking vessel and the serving dish. Sliced apples cooked down in butter and sugar directly in the pan, topped with a single crust and baked until the whole thing bubbled at the edges. Apples cost 20 cents in 1955. Today, around $2. Flour, butter, and sugar for the crust. Total then under 50 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 8. You cooked sliced apples in butter, sugar, and cinnamon right in the skillet until they softened and released their juice. You rolled a single crust over the top, tucked the edges into the pan, and baked at 375 until golden. Tucking that crust into the hot iron edge without burning your fingers or tearing the dough was a small physical skill that took exactly as many attempts as it took, and every failed attempt was itself part of the teaching. Skillet apple pie came from farmhouse baking traditions, where a second dish for the crust and a separate pan for cooking the apples was one dish too many. By 1955, it was an autumn standard in rural kitchens. One pan, start to finish, and every burn on a young hand was part of how the lesson stuck. Country ham with red-eye gravy. The Southern breakfast built entirely on what the skillet left behind. A slice of salt-cured country ham fried hard, then black coffee poured straight into the drippings to make a thin, sharp gravy. Country ham cost 39 cents a pound in 1954. Today, around $8. Black coffee. Total then under 50 cents. Today, under $9. Fed 4. You fried the ham slices in the dry skillet until the edges curled and crisped. You removed the ham and poured black coffee into the drippings, scraping up everything stuck to the pan. There was no measurement for how much coffee or how long to scrape. There was only the memory of watching it done correctly, enough times that the amount simply arrived in the hand without being counted. Red-eye gravy came from Appalachian and Southern farm kitchens, where nothing that hit the skillet went to waste, coffee included. By 1954, it was a breakfast standard across the region. Coffee and ham drippings, and nothing else. Skillet cabbage and bacon. The vegetable dish that made cabbage into something people actually wanted to eat. Shredded cabbage fried down in bacon fat until it went golden and sweet, the bacon pieces scattered throughout. A head of cabbage cost 10 cents in 1955. Today, around $2. Bacon and onion. Total then under 40 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 6. You rendered bacon in the skillet until crisp and removed it. You added shredded cabbage and onion to the hot bacon fat and cooked it down slow until the cabbage went soft and caramelized at the edges. You stirred the bacon back through. Knowing how long slow actually meant was a judgment made by smell and color, never by a clock, passed down by someone standing close enough to say, "Not yet," without needing to say much else. Skillet cabbage and bacon came from German and Irish immigrant traditions carried into the industrial Midwest. By 1955, it was a weeknight standard in working-class kitchens. Cabbage nobody wanted turned into cabbage everybody fought over, by hands that had been shown exactly how far to let it go. Skillet cinnamon rolls. The Sunday morning treat baked directly in a buttered cast iron skillet, so the rolls rose pressed against each other, pulling apart soft and caramelized at the edges where the pan had done its work. Flour, yeast, and butter cost under 40 cents in 1955. Sugar and cinnamon added a dime. Total under 50 cents for a skillet that fed 8. You rolled the dough with cinnamon sugar and butter, sliced it into rounds, and arranged them touching in a buttered skillet. You let them rise once more before baking until golden. Judging when the dough had risen enough the second time was a matter of touch, a gentle press with one finger that either sprang back or did not. A test that could only be demonstrated, never described precisely enough to trust from words alone. Skillet cinnamon rolls came from farmhouse Sunday baking traditions across the Midwest. By 1955, they were the reason children got out of bed early on the one morning nobody had anywhere to be. The edges caramelized against the iron in a way no baking sheet ever managed, a difference every daughter had to taste before she believed it. Skillet cornbread dressing. The Thanksgiving side built from the same skillet cornbread made all year, crumbled and mixed with celery, onion, and broth, then baked until the top went crisp and the inside stayed soft. Cornbread from a previous baking cost nothing extra. Celery, onion, and broth added 30 cents. Total under 50 cents for a dish that fed 10. You crumbled day-old skillet cornbread into a bowl. You cooked celery and onion in butter until soft. You combined everything with broth and egg and baked it in the same skillet until the top crisped. Knowing exactly how wet the mixture needed to be before baking was tested by hand, a squeeze that either held together or fell apart, a feel passed down from a mother's hand to a daughter's without a single measuring cup between them. Skillet cornbread dressing came from Southern holiday cooking traditions built entirely around the same skillet used all year. By 1955, it was the centerpiece beside every holiday turkey in the region. The dressing that only tasted right because the cornbread underneath it had been made in that same iron for years. Pan-fried trout. The riverside supper that turned the morning's catch into dinner within the hour. Whole trout dredged in cornmeal and fried in bacon fat until the skin went crackling and the flesh stayed flaky underneath. A trout caught fresh cost nothing but time in 1955. Cornmeal and bacon fat added 15 cents. Total under 20 cents for a fish that fed 2. You cleaned the trout and dredged it whole in seasoned cornmeal. You fried it in hot bacon fat in the skillet, 3 minutes aside, until the skin crisped and the flesh flaked at the touch of a fork. Knowing exactly 3 minutes, without a timer, meant watching the edges of the skin, a signal that had to be pointed out once by someone who already knew, standing over the same fire, before it could ever be recognized alone. Pan-fried trout came from Appalachian and rural fishing traditions, where the catch went straight from the creek to the skillet. By 1955, it was a summer standard in households near any river worth fishing. The fish that fed a family for the cost of patience, taught the same way patience always gets taught, by someone willing to wait beside you. Skillet peach cobbler. The summer dessert that baked ripe peaches under a golden batter crust. All of it started and finished in the same well-worn pan. Peaches cost 20 cents a basket in 1955. Flour, sugar, and butter added 30 cents. Total under 50 cents for a cobbler that fed 8. You melted butter in the skillet. You poured batter over it and spooned sweetened peaches on top without stirring. You baked it until the batter rose up through the fruit and went golden.
Skillet scalloped potatoes. The creamy potato dish baked entirely in the same skillet it started in.
Thin potato slices layered with a cream sauce and baked until the top went golden and the potatoes underneath went completely tender. Potatoes cost 20 cents for 5 pounds in 1955. Today, around $3. Milk, butter, and flour. Total then under 50 cents. Today, under $5. Fed 6. You built a cream sauce right in the skillet with butter, flour, and milk. You layered in thin potato slices and onion. You baked the whole thing at 350 until the top browned and the potatoes went soft all the way through. Slicing the potatoes thin enough that they cooked through without turning to mush was a knife skill built entirely on repetition, watched and then copied, and then, eventually, done without watching at all. Skillet scalloped potatoes came from farmhouse cooking that avoided dirtying a second pan whenever possible. By 1955, it was a Sunday side across rural American kitchens. The skillet did the sauce and the baking, and the hands that built the sauce had learned it from other hands, standing exactly where you would have stood. Fried okra. The southern side that turned a vegetable most of the country did not know what to do with into a crisp, addictive dish. Sliced okra dredged in cornmeal and fried hard in the skillet until the coating went deep golden. Okra cost nothing from the garden in 1955. Cornmeal, egg, and lard. Total then under 20 cents. Today under $3. Fed 6. You sliced the okra into rounds. You dredged them in cornmeal seasoned with salt and pepper. You fried them in hot fat in small batches so the pieces did not steam each other until the coating went crisp and dark gold. Knowing not to crowd the pan was never explained in words. It was learned by watching a batch go soggy once and never again because the lesson had been shown rather than told. Fried okra came from southern garden cooking, using the summer's most prolific vegetable in the way that made it disappear from the plate fastest. By 1955, it was a summer standard across the South.
Skillet biscuits and gravy. The southern breakfast that started with biscuits baked in the same skillet that would soon hold the gravy. Sausage crumbled and browned, then a peppery white sauce built from the drippings and poured generously over the split biscuits. Flour, lard, and buttermilk for the biscuits cost 20 cents in 1955. Sausage, milk, and pepper added 40 cents. Total under 60 cents for a breakfast that fed 6. You baked biscuits in the hot skillet until golden. You browned sausage in the same pan after the biscuits came out, then built a cream gravy from the drippings, heavy on the black pepper. Knowing how much flour the sausage fat could hold before the gravy turned gluey instead of silky was never once written down correctly enough to trust. It had to be watched, whisk in hand, until the feel of it settled into memory. Skillet biscuits and gravy came from Southern and Appalachian farm breakfast traditions. By 1955, it was the meal that got a working family through a full morning on almost nothing. The gravy that only tasted right in the hands of someone who had stood close enough once to see exactly how it was done. Skillet beef stew. The one-pot supper that browned stew beef hard in the skillet before building the whole meal around what the meat left behind. Carrots, potatoes, and onions simmered slow in a broth, deepened by everything stuck to the bottom of the pan. Stew beef cost 49 cents a pound in 1955. Today, around $7.99. Potatoes, carrots, and onion added 30 cents. Total then under $1. Today under $12. Fed 6. You browned the beef hard in batches so it never steamed. You built the broth in the same pan, scraping up every dark bit stuck to the iron. You added vegetables and simmered until everything went tender. Knowing the beef needed to sit undisturbed long enough to actually brown, rather than being turned too soon out of impatience, was a lesson every young cook learned only once she had ruined a batch by moving it too early. Skillet beef stew came from farmhouse cooking traditions built on the cheapest cuts and the patience to treat them properly. By 1955, it was a Sunday standard across rural American kitchens. The stew that tasted like the whole afternoon it took to make. And like every afternoon, someone had spent teaching another person not to rush it. Chili con carne. If the 1970s slow cooker had a signature dish, this was it. Chili appeared in the very first rival crock-pot cookbook, published in 1971, and it never left. It became the recipe that sold the appliance, that convinced skeptical husbands and curious neighbors that this orange ceramic pot on the counter was not a gimmick, but a genuine addition to the kitchen. The logic was irresistible. Chili was always better after a long simmer. On the stovetop, that meant standing over it, stirring it, adjusting it, watching the bottom to make sure it did not scorch. In the slow cooker, it meant browning the beef and onion in the morning, adding the beans and tomatoes and chili powder, setting the lid, and walking away until the smell brought everyone to the kitchen on its own. What came out after 8 hours was richer and deeper than anything a 2-hour stovetop version could produce. The spices had time to bloom and mellow. The beef had broken down into the sauce. The beans had absorbed everything around them and become part of something unified. Served in heavy bowls with cornbread on the side, it was the meal that made the slow cooker a permanent fixture in the American kitchen. Nobody ever made just enough for one night. Beef Burgundy. This was the recipe that gave the slow cooker its sense of occasion. Beef Burgundy, beef braised in red wine with mushrooms and pearl onions, had always been considered a dish that required skill and time and attention. A special occasion meal from a French tradition that most American home cooks admired from a respectful distance. The slow cooker changed that calculation entirely. She browned the beef cubes and dropped them into the crock with the wine and the broth and the mushrooms and the tiny onions that had been such a nuisance to peel. And by evening, she had a dish that tasted like a restaurant and had cost her less than 20 minutes of actual work. The wine reduced slowly over the hours and concentrated into the beef, giving it a depth of flavor that no quick braise could approach. The mushrooms soaked up the wine-dark liquid and became almost meaty in their own right. The pearl onions dissolved into sweetness that balanced the richness of everything else. It smelled, when the lid came off, like something that had been tended all day by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She had known exactly what she was doing. She just had not been standing in the kitchen doing it. Hungarian goulash. Goulash came to the American slow cooker by way of the Central European immigrant communities that had brought it to the Midwest and the industrial cities of the East in the early 20th century. And by the 1970s, it had settled firmly into the mainstream. Every crock-pot cookbook of that decade included at least one version of it, because goulash was exactly the kind of dish that the slow cooker understood. She cut beef chuck into cubes and combined them in the crock with sliced onion, garlic, canned tomatoes, beef broth, and a generous measure of sweet paprika. More paprika than most recipes called for, because the long cook mellowed its intensity, and what seemed like too much in the morning was exactly right by evening. A spoonful of caraway seeds if the family liked them. A bay leaf always. After 8 hours, the beef was impossibly tender, and the broth had become a thick, deeply red sauce that smelled of paprika and slow-cooked onion in a way that was entirely its own. Served over egg noodles with a dollop of sour cream stirred through the sauce at the last moment, it was the kind of meal that made the table feel gathered. That is the only word for it. Gathered. Nobody left hungry. Nobody left quickly either. Sloppy Joe sauce. Sloppy Joes are easy to underestimate, and that is a mistake. In the 1970s, when the slow cooker version appeared in cookbooks aimed at families with children, it solved a problem that every parent with a weeknight party or a crowd of neighborhood kids recognized immediately.
How do you keep sloppy Joe sauce hot and ready for hours without standing over it? She browned the ground beef with onion and green pepper, drained the fat, and transferred everything to the crock with ketchup, mustard, brown sugar, Worcestershire sauce, and a little vinegar to balance the sweetness. The lid went on, and the sauce held at a perfect serving temperature for as many hours as it needed to. The slow cook did something else as well. It took the sharp edges off the ketchup and mustard and let the sweetness and the savory elements find each other over time. The sauce was thicker and smoother after hours in the crock than it ever was fresh off the stovetop, and it scooped onto buns without running everywhere in the way that stovetop versions always seemed to. At a table full of children, that mattered more than anyone who was not at that table might understand. Chicken and dumplings. Chicken and dumplings was one of the oldest comfort dishes in the American South, and the slow cooker version became one of the most discussed recipes in crock-pot cookbooks of the 1970s because the technique for the dumplings was specific and required explanation. She cooked the chicken with broth and vegetables on low for 6 hours until the chicken was completely tender and falling off the bone. She removed the chicken, shredded the meat, and returned it to the broth. Then, with the heat turned to high and the broth bubbling gently, she dropped spoonfuls of biscuit dough across the surface, replaced the lid, and waited 30 minutes without lifting it. Lifting the lid was the one thing that could ruin the dumplings. After 30 minutes, they had puffed into soft, pillowy rounds that sat half-submerged in the golden broth and had absorbed it from beneath while steaming from above. They were tender in a way that stovetop dumplings, always at risk of becoming rubbery in a rolling boil, rarely managed to achieve. The broth had become almost a gravy. The chicken was everywhere through it. On a hot summer evening, this was the meal that made people go quiet in a good way. Swiss steak. The tough, round steak braised low in tomato until it surrendered into something fork-tender. Round steak cost 59 cents a pound in 1973. Today, around $6. Canned tomatoes, onion, and flour. Total, then, under $1.50. Today, under $9. Fed 6. You pound flour into the steak and brown it hard. You add tomatoes and onion. You cover and simmer 90 minutes. The steak goes completely tender. The gravy thickens dark and red. The onions melt into it. Swiss steak came from American and British braising traditions. By 1973, it was in every general cookbook nationwide. The cheapest steak braised tender, a $2 Sunday supper. Tuna noodle casserole. The one-dish supper of tuna, noodles, and cream soup topped with crushed potato chips. A can of tuna cost 29 cents in 1973. Today, around $1.89. Noodles, cream soup, and peas. Total, then, under $1.50. Today, under $8. Fed 6. You mix soup with milk, noodles, tuna, and peas. You top with crushed chips and bake until bubbling. The casserole bubbles at the edges. The chips go crisp and golden. The tuna flakes throughout. Tuna noodle casserole came from American convenience cooking. By 1973, it was in cookbooks nationwide. The Friday casserole that fed a family for under $2. $2 was never a limitation. Goulash. The one-pot supper of ground beef and macaroni simmered in tomato with paprika. Ground beef cost 39 cents a pound in 1973. Today, around $5.50. Macaroni, tomatoes, onion, and paprika. Total then under $1.50. Today, under $9. Fed 6. You brown beef with onion. You add tomatoes, macaroni, paprika, and water. You simmer until the macaroni goes tender. The macaroni soaks up the tomato, The beef settles throughout. The paprika warms it. American goulash came from Hungarian-influenced home cooking. By 1973, it was in every family cookbook. One pot of beef and macaroni, $2, and everyone fed. She never apologized for what a meal cost. She set it on the table like it was worth something. And it was. It still is.